Looking for real stories that lift you up? Welcome to Inspire and Impact, the podcast where purpose meets perseverance. This is where transformation begins and your story continues.
Welcome to the Inspire and Impact podcast show. I'm your host, Daniel Rosenstein. Today I have the honor of interviewing Jen Newberg. Jennifer, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Can you share a little bit about yourself with the audience?
Sure. Do you want the long or the short version?
Whatever you feel like.
I'll give you the medium version. So, as Daniel said, my name is Jen. I live just outside of Boston, Massachusetts, but I grew up in South Florida, in the Fort Lauderdale area. I was an only child to two pretty great parents. As I talk about it, usually when I share my story, I break it up into three sections: my experience, my strength, and my goal. I'll start with the experience part, and then maybe we can kind of converse on the other parts of it. But experience was, like I said, grew up in a pretty normal household, went to University of Florida, had a pretty good, I'm in college. I then moved to New York City, and I met my first husband on 9/11. Yes, 9/11, 2001. So interesting story in and of itself. And we got married shortly after, had my daughter, who's now 16. We got divorced a few years after that. And, I went back out into the dating world where I met my second husband. His name was Jim. And he had two kids. So he had Landy and Drew, my stepkids. And so we became a blended family, which is difficult for anybody out there who is the parent of a blended family. It's not easy. There's definitely ups and downs. But we lived through it. And also during this time, a big part of my story is that I drank a lot, and it started to become the solution to my problems. And I knew I needed to stop, and I couldn't. And the disease of alcoholism set in pretty deeply in my life. And as about, I guess it was probably about 6 years into my marriage with Jack, I actually got sober, and I'm in active recovery now. It's a really big part of my life. And, my marriage with Jack was wonderful, but it was chaotic. He was incredible. He was the love of my life. And we planned this really great trip to Greece. We had planned it for over a year. It was going to be about 2 weeks. And it was the longest time we had taken vacation from work in a long time. A 2-week vacation from work is a pretty big deal. And we went to Greece, and on the fourth night of our vacation, he woke me up in the middle of the night in our hotel room, and he said, "I think I'm having a heart attack." And, I didn't know how to react. I ran downstairs. I went to the front desk. I said, "We have to call 911. And they looked at me and said, there really is no 911. We were on the island of Mykonos. It was just on the edge of off and on season. And so there wasn't a lot of people there. And so I ran back upstairs with the owner of the hotel we were at, who was a saint. And we did the best we could to keep him alive. But he passed away within about 10 minutes of that time. And I had to navigate in a foreign country by myself, and the logistics that go along with that. I felt, fairly lucky at the time. I was able to come home pretty quickly within about 24 hours of his passing. And I came home to chaos, well-meaning chaos, as they say. There were tons of people in my home. Everybody was clearly in shock. It was incredibly traumatic to watch somebody that you love die. Life-changing, not in the best ways. And, I really had to navigate the chaos, and I didn't do a very good job in the beginning. In fact, about a month after he died, I myself took myself to the hospital, and I thought that I was having a heart attack, and I now know, and I learned it was more of a panic attack. And I had gone back to work at the time, and I realized that was a terrible idea given the trauma I had experienced. And so I took some time off work, and, really thought about what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. And I actually was lucky enough to go on a retreat in Costa Rica about 6 months after he died. I was like, I need to get out of here. Again, just everything was like, and the logistics and the emotions and the family and like everything. I was like, I just need a space to breathe. And so I went on this really incredible wellness retreat. It was actually a yoga retreat. And funny story from there is that I got there and I met some really lovely but much younger women than myself. And one of them ran over to me all giddy and excited and said, "So how much do you practice?" And I said, "Practice what?" And she said, "Yoga." And I said, "I don't." And she goes, "You're on a yoga retreat, right?" And I was like, "Yeah, I just kind of needed to get away from my life." And she was like, "Oh, okay, strange woman." And you know what? It had a lot of the impact that I needed it to have. I was able to disconnect from the chaos of life. And what I also realized was, I did not necessarily connect with the women on the retreat, although they were really lovely and wonderful. I kind of thought back to my roots in recovery and the importance of connection and recovery. And I, on my way home from the retreat, said, "You know what? I need this in my life from a widow perspective." At that point, I had been a widow for about 7 months and nobody understood. I had great family, great friends. Everybody wanted to be really supportive, but it was hard for people to understand what I had gone through. And so I began my journey and created what's now my business. It's Lifey, which is really a mission-based business to create connection for widows. And I've hosted retreats for widows. I've hosted support groups. I have a new kind of 2.0 launching, which I can talk about in a minute. But my life is really centered on the idea that connection is the antidote to loneliness. And we live in a society that's incredibly lonely. In fact, our former Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy, wrote a book about the loneliness epidemic. And in his book, he has a quote that says, "Loneliness is as detrimental to your mental health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day is to your physical health." And so it's pretty dangerous. And, I wanted to do my part in helping to create connection amongst widows. And it's been a beautiful experience. It's sad sometimes and it's hard a lot, but I've met some incredible women. Incredible women have met each other. I now feel like I have this fellowship of this community and micro communities throughout the different things that I've done, and everyone gets it. And that's really, that was really the goal. And, I often look back at, my 20 years between, I would say 25 and 45, and all of the trauma between my divorce and my addiction and getting remarried and step parenting, and then obviously culminating in the death of my husband. And it's really easy to go down what I call the pity party path, which is basically, this is really sucky, but it's my experience. It's what's happened in my life. I can't change it. And I try and stay in gratitude. And I try and look at, okay, this happens. It's my past. I can't change it. And I am now grateful that I can use those experiences to inspire and to help other people. Again, that was the medium version. There's lots more details within there. I'm a very open and honest person. I will tell you anything you ever want to know and more. In fact, I often say I will tell you things that you wouldn't even tell your best friend. And I share it with audiences of hundreds of people sometimes because I never want anyone to feel alone. And if that little dirty detail makes them say, "Oh my God, I feel that way too," then I feel like I've helped somebody.
Wow, Jennifer, that was like a mouthful. Thank you for being so brave and coming on and sharing that with everybody. It definitely takes a lot of guts because some people don't feel comfortable sharing all of that. That's definitely a lot you went through. I'm sorry you had to go through all that. I know what it's like to lose like a family member. It's not fun at all. It's very emotional and difficult, and it takes time to get over that grieving process. By any chance, do you remember what you were like thinking or feeling when you were flying back home from Greece from your vacation? What was going through your mind? Did you have any previous knowledge that your husband at the time had like heart problems? Or was this like a complete shock, like out of the blue?
Yeah, it was a complete shock out of the blue. He was 49 years old and he was perfectly healthy to our knowledge. He went to the gym every day. He ate really well. His autopsy report did reveal that he had heart disease, but it wasn't something that at least I knew about. And so, yeah, it was completely out of the blue. And, you asked about that trip back. I will, to this day, I'm 47 years old, and I will say that day was the hardest day, the hardest, 8 hours in my entire 47 years of life. My dad, who is one of the most wonderful men, and one of Jack's sisters offered to come and fly with me. And I thought it was kind of ridiculous for them to fly to Grace and then literally turn around and get on a plane back. In hindsight, I kind of wish I had them to do that. That being said, I do have a really beautiful story from it. As I was sitting in the airport crying and hysterical, and this woman came over to me and she said, you look, distraught. And I said, I am. And she said, can I pray for you? And I'm not a religious person. I consider myself spiritual, but not religious by any means. And I said, yeah, please. And she got down on her knees, and I don't know what she said. I had told her at that point that my husband had unexpectedly passed, and she said a prayer, and it turned out that she was on my flight, and I wasn't sitting in the area where the flight was departing from. I was just in a more general area, and she ended up being on my flight, and she did come and check on me a few times. And, I do believe that she was put on that plane for a reason. But gosh, you said what was going through my mind. I remember trying to distract myself and watch movies and read, and I just couldn't. I also, when I got to Boston Logan Airport, I arrived at customs, and there was a line a mile long, and I was like, oh my gosh, how am I going to do this? And I actually sat down in the line and just buried my head and cried. And one of the customs officers came over. He said, are you okay? And I said, my husband died yesterday in Greece. And no, I'm not okay. And he very kindly escorted me to the front of the line. I was able to get through fairly quickly. My parents and my daughter were waiting for me outside. I feel very grateful. I will say flying, and I do fly, but it's still difficult for me. And going through customs at Logan Airport is it's a very triggering place for me. But I'm grateful for that man's kindness to not make me stand in that line, because I was already over the edge, but that would have pushed me just a little bit further. So yes, it's interesting that you asked that question, because that day in particular was perhaps worse than, nothing was worse than watching a loved one. I saw him take his last breath, and there's nothing worse than that. But flying home alone was incredibly difficult.
So you mentioned about, becoming a widow, and you also mentioned it's not just about grief, but sometimes you also experience loneliness or feeling disconnected. When did you meet that connection that being a widow is not, it's more than just grief, but there's also an aspect of loneliness and maybe feeling disconnected from other people?
100%. I had very kind and loving people, I'm sorry for your loss, and, what can I do? And, I often joke that my house looked like a florist shop. People send flowers, they send meals, they really do try. But it's nobody, there are definitely, there's lots of people in the world who've experienced the death of loved ones. But when it's a different kind of grief when you lose your husband, your partner, who was there with you side by side for everything. And I was able to connect with an old colleague of mine who had lost her husband a couple of years back. And she was very, very helpful. And, it was with us, it was never, any advice or any commentary. It was just being present with somebody who got it. And, that was also a big part in why I knew I needed this connection. But, nobody, unless you've been through it, it's really, really hard to understand. And there's lots, as I meet widows, I meet widows every day because of what I've been doing with my life. And there are, a lot of men and women who deal with, prolonged death, where their spouses were sick for a long time, whether it was cancer or ALS or dementia. There's a lot of, heart disease, a lot of long-term illness where they are caretakers, and they have been for many, many years. And that is a loss that's slightly different than the traumatic loss of like my situation where, he had already died, or people, who died in a car accident or by suicide, those are more of that kind of unexpected loss. But I have found, and I really believe in that no matter how you got here, we're all still here and we're all still living without our partners. And, going back to, the other part of your question, the loneliness, it's incredibly lonely. I talk a lot about too, I think about it a lot, the difference between being lonely and alone. And I'm working still, I'm a work in progress, and I will be forever. Grief doesn't go away. I'm working on being alone, being okay with being alone, which is a physical, being a physical. There is no one in the house with you, or there is no one in your car, or there's no one in, however you think of being alone. But being lonely is much more of an emotional feeling and that kind of longing for connection and, both physical and emotional and psychological. And so, yeah, it's a really big part of all grief. And again, when you lose your spouse, it's a really big part of grief.
Do you think that some people may misunderstand what grief is really about or what people really go through?
1,000,000%. We do not live in a culture that is grief accepting. Case in point, most, major corporations have 3, maybe 5 days that you get off paid up, paid time off when someone dies. It's just not, I think that our culture has a lot to learn about how to support people going through grief. I also, another thing that I often struggle with is I'm a pretty glass half full person. I'm a pretty outgoing person. I'm a pretty happy person. And people think, oh, she's really busy and she's really happy. That means she's not grieving. And that is 100% not true. One of the things that I learned very early on from my therapist, and, this is a huge thing. This is one of those like being bold and being honest things is you can have 2 feelings at once. And this applies to any life situation, not just grief. And, when my husband died, our marriage wasn't always easy. Marriage is hard. And, or when I talk to people who've been caretakers for a really long time, there can be a sense of relief and a sense of deep sadness. And, I say that even now, not because I feel that now, but because there can be joy and there can be sadness. There can be loneliness and there can be connection. Those 2 things are not all of those things are not mutually exclusive. They can really happen at the same time. And yes, I am having a party tonight with 10 of my friends coming over. Yes, I went to dinner last night. Yes, I'm, active in many different areas, but it doesn't mean that there's not that really deep hole will never be filled. In fact, going back to my therapist, who I am very grateful for, she described it as a blast, a hole that's being blasted through your body that will never necessarily heal. And I feel that. In fact, we are actually, so my husband was cremated in Greece because I had to go through all of the death proceedings, the right word, but all of the logistical things that happened, the autopsy, all of that had to happen in Greece before he could come back to U.S. soil, which that in and of itself is a whole chaotic situation. The U.S. Embassy was wonderful and really helpful, but it's a lot of work. And actually the day after Thanksgiving this year, we'll be burying him. And that just opens up a whole new wound. And it never goes away. And do people understand it? No, but I also don't fault them. I do fault society sometimes for not supporting grieving people more. But I don't fault individuals because unless you've experienced it, you really don't know. And, I have people come to me all the time and say, my friend's mom, or my friend's husband, or somebody passed away. What do I say? What do I do? And because truly, they don't know. And you can't know. And, I think it's really important. And it's, my mission is really around connection. There's also an education piece to it as well.
So you mentioned before that like grief doesn't really go like away. but we can kind of grow around it. So how's like your understanding of grief changed since your husband passed away?
I love that you said that. And I wish I had a piece of paper around here because there is actually a diagram where it's 3 circles. And, the first circle shows, it's a big circle that's grief. And then around it is a much thinner circle of your life and where grief just takes over your entire life. And then the middle circle of grief actually stays the same throughout the entire 3 circles. That grief stays the same, but the outer rim grows a little bit more, and then it grows a little bit more. And it's exactly what you're saying. The grief stays the same, but your life around it builds more and more. And that's how I feel today. I don't feel any less sad or heartbroken or traumatized. That trauma will live with me forever. And it shows up in very unexpected ways and places. I have dreams, I have nightmares. I'll be driving along happy, singing to my radio, and all of a sudden I'm crying. Call them grief bombs. It's good. It's like the crazy, you're in the grocery store, you're, just minding your own business, and all of a sudden it's like something happens. That part doesn't go away, but sure, my life has grown around it. And, I respect everyone's grieving process. There are people who can't get out of bed for 6 months or a year or 2. And that's their process. It's not how I exist. And it's not how I encourage people around me going through it to exist. I don't, because of exactly what you said, when you get up and you get out, your life starts to grow around the grief and it makes it a little less painful.
What were like some moments that like people or certain conversations, like somebody said something to you, like helped you feel more connected and less alone? Because like you mentioned, sometimes you felt alone. Were there's any particular moments in your life or certain people or maybe somebody said something that made you feel, hey, I now have some connection with people. I'm not alone.
One of the things, I'm gonna indirectly answer your question, then I'm gonna directly answer it. One of the things my best friend did, having lost both of her parents, and so she had an idea of profound grief that she did, and I tell people this, is she came to my husband's funeral and she stayed after for a week. Usually people rush in immediately when the death happens. And it's like they surround the person and then the funeral happens and everyone goes away. And so I often share with people, be there in those days after, because that's when the person really needs you. The days before, you've got lots of people. And, the indirect answer is people's lives go back to normal. It's just the way the world works. And so don't forget that person, and it ties to the direct answer, which is continuously check in. And it doesn't have to be anything profound. It can be a text that just says, thinking of you. Or here's something that's funny that happened today. We live in a world dominated by social media where there's memes and videos and TikToks and all of that stuff. Send somebody a funny dog video. Send somebody, something that makes them smile. Because making it not about the grief and making it about just, again, that life growing around it and the fact that life is around it, I find, and I can't speak for everybody, but I find to be really helpful. I also, and, it's part of, another thing that I share is the reason that I tell my story as often as I possibly can is I believe that a problem shared is a problem cut in half. And I believe that every time I share it, I heal just a little tiny bit. And that's because I can help somebody else heal. We are, by nature, most people are giving people. We want to help other people. And that helps, heal me. And so I tell people, share your truth. It's your truth. Own it. Share it. You never know who you're going to help. In fact, I'm working with a guy who's a master storyteller to teach widows and other, specifically widows in my case, how to tell your story. And in what cases are appropriate to tell it in one way versus another. Me, I never have any, there's no appropriateness of you're going to hear it no matter where I am, what I'm doing, you're going to hear the whole truth and nothing but the truth. but not everyone's comfortable with it. But I've heard from lots of people that when they share what happens, it gets a little easier each time. And it is a little bit more, it is healing. Not in the beginning. In the beginning, it's super traumatizing, having to repeat your story over and over and over again, which happens. What happens? You get a lot of that. Oh my God, what happened? Oh my God, what happened? And, there's, you're like, I don't want to talk about this anymore. But once that passes, and it does, that kind of initial shock of people wanting to know, I keep telling your story. And also, the other piece of it too, as I'm sitting here thinking about this and having this discussion with you, is that it keeps their memory alive too. One thing I experienced about 4 months after Jack died, at this moment where I was like, oh my gosh, everyone forgot about him. And I went on Facebook and I posted and I just said, can people share, their favorite memory of Jack? It's like a simple post. And I got, 30 or so comments. But I keep that going. And whenever I run a group session, support group, retreat, whatever I do, I always start with people lighting a candle, sharing their partner's name, and some sort of a prompt of, when did he make you smile? What was your favorite memory? What was something that you like to do together? Because I think it's really, it's really important to keep their memory alive. And every time I share my story, I think of him.
So what point did the pain you're experiencing with all this grief that you realize that you can turn that pain into purpose? And this connection that you were longing for is something you can build and not just sit around and wait for it to happen eventually, like in months or years down the road.
So I had that moment, coming back from the retreat where I had been craving that connection and I didn't get it. And so I kind of said, well, I'm going to create it on my own. And I realized not everyone is doing that. But, so that was a moment in time, a specific moment for me. But, every woman that I speak to or that I engage with, I tell them how brave they are because they've made that step. They've made that step to self-care. And I got to tell you, there are some women who lost their husbands 7 years ago who are still looking for connection. There are some that lost their husband 2 weeks ago and they're looking for that same connection. And, turning that pain into purpose, it's every connection that I make makes me want to do this more. And that's the purpose part of it. That's the, kind of what is my purpose is to continue to find these women who, may not know what to do, who are looking for their people and help them to find them. And, I definitely, if it's a message that I'm giving people, and again, this doesn't necessarily have to do with it doesn't, you don't have to be a widow to take this advice, but go find your people, find your community, find a connection and go out and help somebody. Because when you help somebody, you help yourself. And, that's really what, I had the moment, but it's been a slow burn as far as realizing the impact that it's not just me. It's not about me. Yes, I am the one leading it, but it's every woman that comes along. I feel like the Pied Piper where it's, yes, I'm kind of at the front, but every person that joins the journey is now going out and bringing in more people and bringing in more people. And it starts to compound. And, so many people that I, meet say, hey, I want to do this too. I want to go help people in my community too. And that's the most amazing thing, how it spread, for me. And again, I go back to, I told it before, I can't change the past. And I could sit on I could have my, my pity body party, or I can do something about it. It's really simple. But I've chosen to do something about it. Doesn't mean it hurts less. Doesn't mean I'm not grieving. Doesn't mean I didn't sit on my closet floor and hold my husband's ashes and cry my eyes out last Saturday night. But I made a choice. And, I talk about choice a lot too in my life and in other people's life. We all have choices. We might think we don't, but you do. Any person, over the edge of, 24, when your prefrontal cortex is developed. And, you, at that moment in your life or that time period in your life, you get to make choices and you can choose to take a step forward or take a step back. You can choose to help somebody or not help somebody. You can choose to set boundaries in your life or not. You can choose to take care of yourself or not. You can choose to take the garbage out or not. You can choose, it's the simple things to the complicated, but, everybody has a choice. And so it's up to you what that choice is going to be.
So then, like you mentioned before, that you created your business called It's Lifey. What were like the first steps you took, like in establishing that business?
So I laugh because I don't know how to run a business. I'm not a business. My background is marketing and PR. And then I worked in nonprofit for a while for Boys and Girls Club of America, which is an incredible organization. I did corporate partnerships. And, the idea of starting a business, I had no idea what I was doing. I just knew that I wanted to help people. And the first thing was the retreat. And I started planning, I'd planned a million events in my career. And I was like, oh, this is just like an event. So I started planning that in December of 2024. And in January, I decided that there was much more to it. And then this was going to be a full-blown company. And when, It's Lifey comes from the phrase, life gets lifey. And everyone's life is lifey. And I had this giant mission where I was going to create communities for everyone going through life transition. That was my mission statement. And it was going to be people going through divorce and people going through blended families and parents who were dealing with kids with mental health, issues, and all of these things were happening in this world. And I remember my first meeting with the woman who helps me with my social media. And she said, so who's your audience? Everyone. Everyone goes through lifey moments. And she said, not really going to work for this. And it took me 6 months to realize that was a really big bite to take from the apple. And, I've really had to learn to streamline and to focus on one community at a time. It's not to say I won't grow it in the future, but right now I am very narrowly focused on widows. There are 6.5 million widows under the age of 65 in the U.S. A lot of people. It's a big audience that needs help. And, the other kind of funny part about it is that when I started this business in February, I had all these ideas. I'm a visionary. I like to brainstorm and come up with ideas, and I put them in a PowerPoint because that's what I knew how to do. And I shopped it around. I went to everybody I had ever worked with and known and admired and respected. I said, here's my 5 ideas. Which one do you like best? And I met with this one woman. I gave her my deck. And we met a couple weeks later and I said, what do you like? And she goes, you know what, Jen? I think you need to focus. I think you need to ditch the deck, ditch these ideas. Why don't you run a support group in this this facility that she, worked at, and go from there. And that was really important advice. And that support group has now, turned into more support groups. The other thing that I've learned, which is why I am shifting my business right now, is that I am only one person. Anybody who believes they can clone themselves out there, which is what I did, you can't. It's not actually, possible. And so I can only run so much. I thought everything had to be in person. I was convinced that this was not going to work unless people were physically together. I don't believe that anymore. Here we are on a, Zoom podcast, virtual world, having this really wonderful connection. And I don't know if we're ready to get here yet, but this new kind of version of my business is very digital and virtually based because I can't be everywhere at once. And I want to help as many people as I can. And that's really the way to do it. So it's definitely been, I've learned a lot. I've learned about the business model, how it's supposed to go like that, not like that. I've worked with some really great partners who I learn from all the time, some great business strategists. And, that's how I've gotten where I am today from a business perspective and this is the most important thing for me, without losing the mission, which is community. Not in, I can come up with a million mission statements, a million impact statements, and trust me, I do all the time. And at the core, the one thing that is consistent in all of them is community.
You mentioned, I was curious because you mentioned before that somebody said that loneliness can be like an epidemic.
Mhm.
So from your perspective, why do you think so many people feel lonely these days? What is going on?
That is a big reason. We hide behind our phones. We don't need to go outside when we can, doom scroll all night long.
First, I had no idea what you were doing. I thought you were
You're
taking
like,
like
watch
with
your phone, put it because this is a huge part of the loneliness epidemic is that we don't interact with human beings. We text, we go on social media. It's really easy to isolate. Really, really easy to isolate. And when you isolate, the loneliness circle, starts to grow around you. It was one of my reasons for being like, we have to be in person. I've moved past that. But, so I think technology is a big piece in the loneliness epidemic. I hate to use the C word, but COVID, it changed all of our lives, no matter whether you were 1 year old or years old, rather, when it happened. Put us all in isolation and people liked it. Whether they, most people bitch and most people complain about it, but a lot of people, excuse me, my daughter, see her thing just went on. Flourish, real life, is real life. See it, I can't grab it. Sorry, I should have been more prepared there. And, people were forced to isolate and they kind of liked it. And so, yeah, I mean, there's definitely, isolation and loneliness kind of go hand in hand. And, for people, I'm an extrovert. It's not, loneliness is very uncomfortable for me. There are many more people who really, who feel comfortable in it. And it can be really dangerous. Going back to this, and if you read or if you ChatGPT summarize, Dr. Murthy's, book, it just talks about how dangerous it can be when people are interacting with each other.
So what is, like you said, like now that you're building like this community for women, which I think is really wonderful. I'm glad you're doing it because it is very much needed. But what does like an authentic community look like to you? Where you're like you're building connections, you're helping other women build connections, rather than being something really superficial. Where like you said, a lot of these things on social media, it's very superficial and fake. They put up a meme, I feel good today, which is it does help you for 2 seconds, and then 2 minutes later you forget about it.
So I guess this is as good a time as ever to describe what's coming.
Yeah.
So starting in January, I'll be building something that's called Hope Hub. And there are a lot of digital platforms out there who are, community-based platforms. They're community, and one of them is called Circle. And that's the platform that I'm using. And there'll be 5 different elements to it. The first is the ability to introduce yourself, tell your story if you want to, and connect with other people who have similar background, could be someone that lives in your town, could be somebody that lives in, that had the same experience with you, but it's a one-to-one connection that's reciprocal. What I find in communities like Facebook communities or the more superficial community is somebody will post something. I had the worst day ever. I really missed my husband. And everybody will comment, me too. Oh, me too. This happened to me. This happened to me. But they're not communicating with each other. And what I'm hoping to build is this kind of reciprocal communication where you can see somebody that seems like you or that you believe gets you and have a conversation with them. And it's all based on a couple of principles. The first is honesty. If you're not honest, then, you talked about authentic connections. Like you can't build an authentic connection if you're not being honest with yourself or with the other person. The second is judgment. There's no judgment allowed. And if I see it, I'll nip it in the bud right away. We are all, we could come from different backgrounds, different socioeconomic status, religion, sexuality, doesn't matter. We all lost our partner. That's it. And, the honesty that I will foster amongst this community, the lack of judgment, the fact that we're not here to fix each other. We're here to support each other. And, if someone comes into the community, is like, you should do this and you should do that and that's not what this is about. I will be having, experts part of the community, and that's their job. That's not our job. And so this Hope Hub, the most central part of it is this reciprocal conversation piece where people can talk to each other back and forth. And who knows, someday maybe meet each other. Maybe that in-person dream of mine comes true. The second piece of the community will be online support groups. I will facilitate 10 to 12 of them a week, so a lot. And you'll be able to look at a calendar and you'll be able to see, on Thursday at noon, there's a conversation about anger. I'm really angry. I'm really pissed that this happened. I want to go talk about it. Or on Tuesday night at 6:00, there's a conversation about regret. I wish I did this. I wish I did that. And there'll be open conversation meetings as well, but you'll be able to see a calendar and you'll be able to see times where you can jump on and have, these actual conversations like you and I are having right now. I haven't mentioned this yet, but I always want to talk about being honest and authentic. I am not a therapist. I'm not a coach. I'm a community builder, a facilitator. I am, I'm also not here to fix people's problems. I'm here to connect people who need each other. And so when we have these conversations, these online community conversations, I'm just asking questions that people want to answer because I know it's based on my own experience. I wish somebody had asked me. And so I want to ask them. And so that's the authentic piece of it too, is this is really only because of what I experienced. When I write a paper that I hand out to people, it's just from what I've learned. I'm not going into a book and pulling out pages. It's not research based. It's not medically, blessed. It's experience based. And so the first part, the community part, the second part is the connection groups, the support groups. And then, there's 5 parts. I'm only going to go through 3. The third part is what I just referred to, is that we don't get to fix each other, but I'm going to have plenty of vetted resources and people and have conversations with people through the platform and opportunities to ask questions with attorneys, financial advisors, therapists, grief coaches, real estate agents, storytellers, writers who are really good at journaling, anybody who can answer a question that a widow might have. And that's how I think about it. What were all the things I wanted to know? And who are the people that can help? And so bringing those people as expert resources, because I am not one and the widows are not them. And so who are these experts that can, who are these people I can have conversations with who can actually answer some of those questions that are more fact-based than feelings?
Well, that's really amazing. It sounds like you spent a lot of thought and time into building these ideas because it's very thorough. And I don't know if a community like this already exists online, but it sounds like it's something that's very much needed because I can imagine a lot of people, they say, like, when you do become a widow, it's probably a lot of times it's unexpected. You don't know what to do or who to go to or who to trust. So it's so nice that you have almost like a one-stop shop where you just join the community and they help you with all the different aspects and the different perspectives that you need to think about. So you can just relax and almost have, feel that connection and feel you're being supported instead of being alone, saying, oh my God, I have to figure everything out all by myself, which is very scary.
It's
That's
super
probably
scary.
one of the tough
Really
things
scary.
about being alone. When you're alone, you probably think you have to figure everything out yourself, figure out these tough choices. Who do I trust? Who do I go to? You said, do I need to talk to a lawyer? Do I not need to talk to a lawyer?
I tell people all the time that, again, type A, extrovert personality here. When Jack died, I got on the phone with all of these professional tax attorneys and lawyers and what have you. And everybody's giving yourself some time. And I took copious notes. I still have them. 6 months later, I went back to all of them and said, I don't remember what we talked about. Can we start again? And so, something else that I hear all the time and that kind of reinforces the need for this is 2 things. Number one is I hear children of parents who had become widows say to me, I wish my mom had this. When I was 10 and my dad passed away, I wish my mom had this kind of community. I hear that a lot. I also hear from widows who are perhaps older and had lost their partners, many years ago, say, I wish I had this then. I wish I had this 10 years ago when my husband died. And so that is, reinforces to me the validity and the need for this, and I hope that 10 years from now, people are saying, thank God I had it, rather than I wish.
So if somebody's listening to our conversation today and they feel kind of alone or, a tremendous amount of grief, what's the first step you think you like them to take or to think?
I want to go to my website. No, I'm just kidding. And be brave. Ask for help. Forget. Okay, scrap the first comment I said. Scrap the bravery. Number one thing, and I guess actually, they go together. Being brave and ask for help. Ask for help. You never know who's going to point you. That person might not be the exact person who's going to help you, but they might know someone, and that person might know somebody. And it could be something as simple as, I had this woman in one of my support groups who couldn't trim her hedges because it was something she did with her husband. And, it was a fairly simple thing, but she just couldn't do it. She couldn't bring herself to do it. And it was during the summer, and we all said, there's lots of college kids around. Why don't you ask, a college kid to come over, pay him whatever you need to pay him. She looked at all of us like we had, you can do that? We were like, yeah. Came back the next time, next week, and she's like, guess what? My garden looks amazing. My front yard looks amazing. And all she had to do was ask for help. And that was a simple, a simple thing that in her mind was really big. And, advice for people want to help. They just don't know how. You need to be specific. And so say, I need help cutting my lawn, or I need help. Of course, now I can't think of I need help because I can't stop crying. Or I need help because I need a friend to come with me to the attorney's office because we're going to go over some really tough stuff that I don't understand. Asking, I think that is my number one piece of advice is humble yourself, get rid of the fear, be brave, and ask for help. And I think the number two part, and again, this all kind of goes together, and there's a reason it all goes together, is give yourself some grace. It's hard. It's really, really hard to lose your partner. And, you don't have to be Superwoman. You don't have to be Superman for the widowers out there. Take it one step at a time. It's okay. You don't have to fix everything tomorrow. And you know what? If you're one of those people who are thinking to themselves, and this happens, I talk to people all the time who are like, oh my God, it's been 5 years and I still haven't started. That's okay too. There's never, there's not a perfect time to start, but ask for help and start, do a little bit at a time.
So if somebody had a question about conversation today, or they're interested in joining your community, how can they do that?
I get to tell my website. No, my website's called itslifey.com. ITSLIFEY.com. It's going through a little construction right now. You won't see it back in construction. Yeah. I'd say the most important thing on there, right now is my contact information. Reach out to me. I think my cell phone number is even on there. I have no, call me, text me, email me. Happy to talk to you or point you in the right direction. I know that's opening a big can of worms, but it's how I feel right now and I'm okay with it. But I have a couple of virtual events in the next 6 weeks through the end of the year. But mainly what it will start to do come January is it will drive you to join Hope Hub. And there'll be a free opportunity through Hope Hub, and then there'll be a membership base, which will be also very inexpensive. I am fully aware of the financial status of widows. And sometimes it's really dark and dreary and really hard because they've lost the breadwinner of their family, or they're working multiple jobs and they have their kids and, everything. And, I want it to be really accessible. But, go to itslifey.com, come join the Hope Hub, come build your community with us. It's going to be really special.
So what do you imagine the future of It's Lifey? Where do you see the community grow within the next 5 years?
Oh, I love that question. Remember I said visionary?
Yeah.
So I have, from I have pretty lofty goals. I hope to have 1,000 people in the community by the end of next year, just widows. I hope to have 1,000 widows by the end of just next year. And then, like I said before, when I first dreamed this up, I wanted to build community for everyone. And, I've learned to temper those expectations a little bit. But in 5 years, I hope we have communities for at least 3 different life transitions. It'll always be the widowhood one will always be. I'm not sure what the other ones will be, but I hope to be able to build new communities for people to connect and to find their people. That's
Jen,
what I hope.
I wanted to thank you so much for coming on the show and being so brave and sharing about your experiences, your feelings. And I think it's so amazing that you were able to find your life purpose and something that could, for a lot of people, you said sometimes they feel like the only thing they can do is just lie in bed. And sometimes they can go on for years. And for you to be able to shift that to something positive, not just for yourself, but the community, I think it's really amazing. So I'm so glad you're able to come on the show and share this with everybody in the audience. I think it's something that a lot of people do need because it's a very important subject. Do you have any last minute remarks you want to mention before we close off the podcast for today?
I want to thank you for having me and for giving audiences, people that inspire them and people that, move people to make change in this world. No one's perfect. And, which also brings me to one of my favorite phrases is progress, not perfection. None of us do this perfectly. Nobody grieves perfectly. There is no such thing. And so whether you're grieving or whether you're, trying to cut your hedges, I don't know, whatever it is that you're trying to do in life, nothing has to be perfect. And, I go back to, what I said, which is, your one piece of advice is ask for help. I know it's hard. Sometimes it's really scary. You don't want to think that you're unable to do something, but ask for help and be really specific in what you need. So that's how I would end. And find your community. Listen, that's what this is about. Find your community. Find your people. It will change your life. It will save your life. I really wholeheartedly believe that. I believe that community is life-saving. So find your people.
I got a lot out of this conversation. I think a lot of people in the audience will too. So again, thank you so much for sharing this. And I hope that, a lot of people resonate with what you're saying and either reach out to your community, join some other communities. I think it is important that people don't feel alone. And so I think that's a very important message. And just thank you again for everything that you're doing. I think it's very important and really, it's so wonderful that we have people like you that are visionaries that see a more positive, hopeful way of living our lives instead of the doom and gloom that we hear like in the media a lot. So that's really great.
It's true. It's true. So yeah. No, thank you so much. I'm obviously incredibly passionate about what I do and what I, hope to do in the future, but it can't just be me. I certainly can't do this alone. And, if you're listening to this right now, like go out and build your own community. No one can do this alone.